the verse of what God says, when he says, my grace is sufficient for you, you need to know if you were to take a look at the Greek language, and it gives you a little more of like an HD living color picture of the Bible. But if you were to look at that, is sufficient, you would see that it is in the perfect tense. And the perfect tense, very simply, is this. Something has happened, like a point, like a dot, a point, and then from that point, there's a line that continues, that just goes on. And so something has happened, and the impact of what has happened continues. And that is what occurred here with Paul's perspective that he gets from God. He gets this perspective that God's power is made perfect in weakness. And really to understand that most clearly, God's power is being perfected in us through weakness. God's power is being perfected. But what we see is that when he gets a hold of this perspective, that was true, that it was okay for him to be in weakness. It was okay for him to be in this pain. That God had a higher purpose for it. That God was going to do something greater because of it. When he got that perspective, it continued to provide him with this ongoing assurance and comfort. And that is what I believe happens when this sequence works its way all the way out in our life. When we go from pain to prayer to perspective. Perspective is that thing that when we got it, when we lock in on that unique, specific message to you in your situation, when you lock in on that, it will yield ongoing fruit and results in your life. It will help you live life in the difficult situations that you're facing. And that's exactly what happened here with Paul. Now, I want to just share a couple of my own stories, and one of the questions that I put up here is, in your life and mission, what is that critical, needed perspective that God has for you? I happen to believe that this one was very unique for Paul. The principle is true and applicable to all of us. God's power is being perfected in our weakness. That principle is true. But this illustrates the very personalness of God, the way he brings a message that was unique for him. And I believe that this perspective is unique to each of us. That the perspective that you need to live life well is different from the perspective that I need to get from God. Does that make sense? Each of us are unique. We're in different situations. I'm not the Apostle Paul. You're not the Apostle Paul. You're not me. And so, that's the way God does. God brings a unique message. Now, I want to just share a couple stories just to try to kind of bring this out a little bit. And the first one has to do with the recent trip that I took with Pastor David. I went with him here this last summer on his trip, and my third time to Africa, and my first time to Egypt and India. Okay, so went on the trip with him, and we've done this a few times, so we kind of know the routine. You jump on a plane, and who knows what's going to happen, But I want to tell you, this trip was very unique in some different ways. I was going to some new countries, really excited about that. But one of the things that happened was right as we're getting ready to go, Egypt basically disrupts. And I don't know if you watched all the news of what's taken place of Egypt recently, when all of that turmoil and all of the craziness that happened with this fight between the government and the Muslim Brotherhood, when that thing was happening, that's right when we were going in, okay? So how do you feel about that? Does that make you feel secure? Do you feel secure? Do you think my wife felt secure? She did not feel secure at all. And that put a lot more on me, because I'm listening to her and really feeling it from her. Man, she's worried about this, and so, I kind of show up and we make our trip over there. God's working. We see God's hand in even our conversations that we had on the plane. It's just amazing. But as we get over there, and, I'm always so out of it. I can't sleep on a plane. David, he's out, man. He's conked. But not me. I can't sleep a wink. So, I get over there. I'm just exhausted and tired. And for some reason, there was just interesting things that happened. We come into Nairobi. An hour after we land, we learn that that very section of the Nairobi airport burned down. It burned down. It's like we're watching the news. That night, we just got in, we're watching the news. The airport just burned down. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, are we going to be stuck here? Gosh, I was just hope Robin doesn't know anything about this, And so, and then I'm hearing all sorts of different things. We're there in our little bungalows, and it's all walled off there where we are in Mamaihu. And so, they're telling, Jiroji is telling a story about how they used actual arrows to fend off perpetrators who had come over the walls to try to rip them off. And so I'm thinking, what century are we in? Knocking arrows to shoot arrows at people who are coming in. And of course, that's where we're staying. And then I'm hearing everything more about Mamaihu and the murders and all the prostitution and all the issues that the city's dealing with. And man, I'm telling you, my fear level just began to grow. And then there's Egypt. And that's where we're going. And there's new stuff coming down. And I'll tell you, I just began to notice something happening in me. And I think I said, gosh, I got this fear thing going on in me. I have this fear. And that's not a good thing when you're on a mission trip, when you're there to serve Jesus. And so I began to seek God and began to go through a process of looking at some scriptures. And eventually, that first night, David is over sleeping soundly in his bungalow. Man, like a baby, I am on my knees late at night, unable to sleep, crying out to God. I am fearful, okay? Pain, right? You see the pain? And I am into the prayer part of this whole thing. I am seeking him. Lord, oh my gosh, deliver me from this. Help me. And it was an amazing night. I looked at different scriptures, and different perspectives kind of begin to kind of work their way in. And I'll tell you, and I kind of tried to sleep. I didn't kind of sleep, but then in the middle of the night, a text comes over. And I look on the front of my phone, and all I see is one word, and that word was courageous. Isn't that something? It was sent from these friends that we hadn't heard of for a longest time, who had just so happened to go down to see the movie Courageous and wanted to let us know that they had seen it. And so this word courageous comes over on the screen, and I am thinking, I just got texted from God. I mean, I am serious. I just got a message from God. And I poured myself out, and when I woke up in that morning, I was an entirely different person. Vertical perspective, my sense of the Lord and his presence had come over me. That area, and I think that area of fear is really an area of sin that was off in me, not trusting, right? I could see it so minutely. I was off. I was wrong. God hadn't changed. I needed to really get the perspective of who he was, and his perspective came to me, I've got you. I've got you. Serve me. And I'm telling you, that perspective carried me through that trip. Even when I'm talking with my young Muslim 17-year-old on the flight into Egypt, when he looks at me after this long conversation of asking all these questions, and then he tells me, you are coming at the wrong time. You are a target here. You are coming at the wrong time, is what he said. Didn't faze me a bit. Even when we went through all the military checkpoints and saw some big old Rambo-like guys come out, man, it was just like, I was carried by God through that trip. I held that perspective the whole time. And so God does this. He shows up, but I want to share another scenario that, oh man, this even feels more personal for me to share this. And I asked Robin, Robin, pray for me on this because I want to make sure the words come out in the right way. But I want to tell you a little bit about my work situation. You know, all of us have challenges in our work situations, don't we? You know, most of us do. And so, you know, one of the challenges for me has been that I was planted a couple churches and was a senior pastor for a long time, but went to a large church, and I'm not the senior pastor there. And that's a big, big difference. But not only am I not the senior pastor, I am not considered a pastor at my church. And I have never, for the 5 years that we have been there, ever spoken on the stage at the church. Now, can you imagine if Pastor David comes back from his trip, and you guys all get together, have one big service, and we say, Pastor David, we love you. Listen, we want you to take a 3-month sabbatical. We have got the stage covered. We've got some different people coming in. We want you to have this break. We love you. And he says, wow, that's so great. And you know, and then, you know, he gets on and he's doing his other stuff. And after a while, he's just twiddling his thumbs, right? Like, what am I doing here, you know? And, you know, then after that 3 months time's over, we say, hey, listen, Pastor David, we kind of like the way this has been working out. And we're thinking we would like you to have a new title. And instead of calling you Pastor David, we're going to call you Parishioner David. Parishioner David. And we have a very significant, important role for you, but you won't be speaking up there. It's back in the office. We've got some things for you to do that are really going to impact the church. So how would that go? Do you think that he'd be wrestling inside? Okay, picture my life. That's my life. That's been my life. So I've had to deal with the struggle, and a lot of it's pride. Darn it, God just brings you right into it, doesn't he? Draws you right into that personal place where, darn it, why do I want to be included in the top group? Is this so important for me? Why do I feel like I need this? Why do I feel dishonored? And I can go through all the rest of the rationalizations. But I found myself going through an internal fight. Fight with their senior pastor. Fight with all the leaders. Fight with anyone else who would fight me. Right? Okay? Everyone is at fault for my life situation. But through this struggle, God and my prayers and my crying out, God brought me the one thing I needed, His grace. And His grace comes in the form of perspective. I saw myself, get this, is this nuts? Does this show you how sick a person can be? I saw myself as being slighted by them. Slighted. And they have empowered me to do huge ministry things in there at that church. They gave me the assignment to write their whole discipleship path material, to design it, to do all that. And I'm feeling slighted where my wife helping me, speaking for God, right? You know, Gary, they have given you an incredible opportunity. Look at what you have a chance to do. And Jesus saying to me, step down, step down, step down. All of your needs for community, all those things, all the honor you want, none of that matters. Step down. Do your assignment. And I will bless it. And I will use it. And so, in a couple different big ways, I've kind of experienced this grace sequence. This way that God's grace comes to us. And boy, has it worked. It has worked. Now what I have to do when I find myself gravitating back to that same self-talk, that same struggle, that same inner thing, I just shift back to the right perspective. I have to maintain that perspective. But if I do, guess what? I can function. I've even showed up to work the other day with a smile on my face. It was incredible, man. I had joy in my heart, and I'm just working with the team. It's great. But I have to maintain that perspective. And you know, I just want to say, you know, a lot of wisdom has come to us through the recovery movement. And one of the tremendous things that Bill Wilson discovered was that if we can learn about ourselves and maintain, and I would say even in the recovery materials, a defeatist humility, a humility that says, man, I'm defeated here, I've lost. If we can maintain that perspective about ourselves and some of our liabilities, our vulnerabilities, and we can walk in the power of God, that we can win. We can win. We can beat the addictions. We can beat the tempting pulls against us. Maintaining a perspective. And so the question I have for you is, I don't know your story, but I'm wondering, can you look back over the last 5 years and can you see this process taking place in you? Can you see how that's happened in the last years of your life, God's grace coming to you? And then maybe you're right in the midst of something right now. I don't know what your challenges are. I don't know what your pains are. I don't know what you're dealing with. But can you see yourself here in this process, in this sequence? Maybe you're in the prayer part where you're pouring yourself out to God. Maybe you're in that place where you're really beginning to dial in a perspective that's a gift to you from God. When God says this, I mean, get this, my grace is sufficient. It's enough. That's what the word means. It's enough. It's enough to carry you. It's enough for you to live life well in your difficult, painful, unperfect situation. But what is that message for you? What is the perspective that God is bringing for you? That's your assignment. That's what you need to figure out. That's what you need to lock in on. And it can be many different things. Perspective is a powerful thing. A couple just Olympic, since we've been watching the Olympics. Yeah, you know, Gracie Gold, is that an awesome name or what? I mean, my goodness, Gracie Gold. I watched the little video piece on her and talking about moving out to California and connecting with her coach. And one of the things that the coach did was he kind of gave her this kind of picture of the way to see herself. And she was to be the warrior princess. You know, these ice skaters, you know, beautiful, skating, elegant, graceful, all this stuff. He's saying, yeah, there's that part, but you gotta fight. When you step out on that ice, you gotta fight. You gotta fight for those jumps and those landings. You gotta be a warrior. He's teaching her how to win by adopting that right perspective. I think a little closer to probably the full truth of this passage, there's the announcer, Scott Hamilton. I don't know if you've ever gone on to see the series, I Am Second series on YouTube. If you've ever done that, many of them are testimonies. And Scott Hamilton tells his story and what happened with him. And eventually he gets one form of cancer, and then he finds out he has another form of cancer, and it's a brain tumor. And so he finds out about this. And this is what he says and shares in his story. He said, I found out that this cancerous tumor in my brain had affected my growth, my height. It had stopped me from growing. And he is 5'4". And then he conjectured, you know, I mean, I'm a gold medal skater. You know, he's got these incredible accomplishments. Part of that was the fact that Scott Hamilton was 5'4". He said, I don't know if I could have ever done it had I been 5'10". And this is what he says, I chose to look at that brain tumor as the greatest gift I had ever been given. That's what he said. Can you imagine the perspective that's coming to him? He's like, and this is often what happens with perspective. There's a shift. There's a reinterpretation. We're seeing it one way. We look at it this way. God says, no, you need to be over here. And so God will give it. He will grant it. I wanted to come back just a little bit on just the broader subject of grace. And I hope you got your assignment. Your assignment is write it out. You got to write it out. You got to lock in on what that perspective is for you. I just want you to get the full sufficiency of God's grace and work the whole sequence. But I also want to say that grace is that it's that big picture concept of God's invasion into our lives with his love. You've been going through the series in Exodus, and I know that you have. I watched one of the messages that Pastor David did, and I said, man, oh man, whew, we are getting deep here. This has really been powerful about looking at the law and even feeling that. That was my impression. Wow, I can kind of feel what that'd be like to be under the law. And so what we have between this Old Testament picture and the New Testament, of course, is Jesus, right? Is that Jesus comes into the picture, and God's grace is there the whole time in the Old Testament picture. He's doing these amazing, gracious, wonderful things for the people all the time. He's the same. But what's not the same between the Old Testament and the New Testament is the covenant. The covenant is not the same. The covenant of the Old Testament was based on law and obedience. The key word, if. If you obey and follow all my commands. Find how many times it says it. Over and over and over again. Of course, somebody like me is waving the white flag, because I failed that again and again and again and again. And so that covenant doesn't work. Doesn't work for me. The new covenant. Jesus ushers in an entire new era. The age of grace. A covenant not based on law and obedience, but based upon God extending his favor. Any person willing to believe and accept what Christ has done for them receives the gift of his grace. And the key word in the new covenant is the word in. And you are in the kingdom, in his favor. You are in Christ Jesus. And once you're in, you can never be out. It's the dot and the line. It's the dot of point of his grace and this beautiful line of God's love continually coming to you, shaping you, working to bring you to be the person he wants you to be. And I would say in the big picture of this passage, God's grace is what he does to hone and help you to fulfill his purposes. That's what God's grace is. That's the way God's grace works. And whatever that is, whether it's his position that he gives through Christ, pain from God, power from God, perspective from God, provision from God, it is all his grace. It is his grace coming to you. And this is why Paul says, I'd rather boast in my weaknesses. I'll boast in my weaknesses. You super apostles, I'll boast in being weak. Because in my weakness, Christ and his power is strong.